Welcome to Palestine Studies TV. I'm Omar Baddar, and we have a great program for you today. We're going to be speaking with Phyllis Bennis, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, or the other IPS as we call it here. She is also the author of a very useful introduction to Israel-Palestine called Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a Primer. Let's start by talking about just a few days ago, we hit the 46th anniversary of the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. What does the occupation look like today, and how has it evolved over time?
I think the easiest way to understand it is to see how much worse it has become. When I first started traveling in the region, which was during the period of the first Intifada, I was there for the first time in 1988, just a few months into the Intifada, things were terrible in many ways. There were curfews being imposed on cities, that sort of thing. But you could also move around in a whole different way. You could move between the West Bank and Israel. You could move from Israel into Gaza. There were no blockades that were permanent. They would be put up on at a certain moment to punish a city or a town. Now it's become routine. The role of the wall, the apartheid wall, and we should note we use that term apartheid partly because it's a powerfully evocative term here in the United States because of its role in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the imagery of overcoming apartheid, the imagery of Nelson Mandela, but it's a fact that Israelis use the same term. They just use the word in Hebrew, hafrada, which means separation. Separation is the English, apartheid is the Afrikaans, hafrada is the Hebrew. Everybody's using the same term. So we shouldn't worry too much about, oh my God, you can't use that term. The Israelis use it all the time. The wall has incredibly narrowed people's lives in Palestine. I have friends in Bethlehem, for instance, a 20-minute drive from downtown Jerusalem. They have 18-year-old kids who have never seen Jerusalem because they're not allowed to go. It's an unbelievable reality. The kinds of curfews and closures and divides that separate one town from another, a village from the town where it can get schools and medical care, those permanent divisions are now taken as a matter of course. The economy has tanked so badly. We hear about this huge level of growth, 7% growth, 8% growth, and it's all concentrated in one little piece of Ramallah, what people call the Ramallah bubble, where rich people live, and they have a great life. I've been there for a couple of years, but the last time I saw it, it was pretty cool. It looked kind of like a downtown suburb of someplace in the United States, very Western, lots of cafes, good coffee, art galleries, music, and the number of people who have access to that is infinitesimal. For the vast majority of Palestinians, employment is down, wages are down, the ability for farmers to sell their goods is down. There's simply no hope. The reality of occupation is immediate and day-to-day and concrete. It's also political and moral in terms of people's lives. But first, it affects everything about how people live. A woman in labor who has to get through an Israeli checkpoint to go to a hospital. That sounds like a cliche. We've heard it for so many years. Well, for any woman in labor today, it's the same crisis. So things are the same or worse in every single area.
So a couple of years ago, there was a large wave of uprisings in the region, and it looked promising. The idea was that we're going to have democracies throughout the Middle East, and all of a sudden Israel was going to have to deal with the populations of the surrounding countries, not just leaders that they can have good terms with. It's looking a little bit differently now. Things are moving in a negative direction in many places, particularly in Syria. It's looking very bad, and there's plenty of talk about potential military intervention. Do you think this now takes the focus away from Palestine, or what is the impact of all the regional developments, particularly Syria, on the situation in Palestine?
I think there's a huge impact from a number of vantage points. Certainly overall, I think that the Arab Spring, the uprisings that emerged, still are overall positive. They all are facing setbacks, one step forward, two steps back. That's inevitable. These challenges are part of processes that will go on for years, perhaps for a generation. But what they have accomplished in so many arenas is to give back to people their claim of citizenship, their rights to be an Egyptian, a Tunisian, maybe even someday a Syrian. I mean, it's not easy, and it's not going well in Syria. It's a disaster in Syria. The impact on Palestinians and on Palestine, one, takes away attention, as you say. Nobody's talking about the occupation of Palestine. Nobody's talking about Israeli apartheid. We're hearing only about the crisis in Syria. But it's not incidental that you never really heard Israel leading the charge for calls to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, or his father, for that matter, Hafez al-Assad. Why? Because despite all the rhetoric about being the resistance arc and the center of Middle Eastern resistance, the Assad family has been pretty damn good to Israel. It has kept the occupied Golan Heights quiet. It has kept the border quiet. It has kept the Palestinian refugees in Syria under quite tight control, despite the fact that they're treated better than in some other countries in the region. They're still under very tight control. And it's been very helpful for Israel. When there was an occasional clash on the border, it was kept narrow, it was kept under control. That hasn't really changed for the Israelis. So they're not so thrilled, I think, at the prospect of regime change in the region. At the immediate level, you see the violence spilling over. First of all, you have thousands of Palestinian refugees in Syria who have been there since they were forced to flee in either 1948 or again in 1967. There are 10 refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. In 7 of those 10 camps, more than half the population has been forced to flee because of the security collapse. So the impact there is immediate. On Palestinians in the rest of the region, there's political impact when Palestinians get blamed for what one or another of their leaders in a certain camp or a certain faction might say. It's a horrific situation, and the problem is the Palestinians have nowhere to flee. They can't go, quote, home, because the Israelis don't allow them in. So the denial of the right of return that has been an ongoing violation of international law since 1948 by Israel is being exacerbated by the creation of new refugees, new internally displaced Palestinians. It's a disaster for Palestine.
Bringing it back here to the United States, there is a significant shift in discourse that you've talked about many times. But can you talk a little bit more about what that shift in discourse looks like, and why do you think it has never translated into a shift in American policy towards Israel-Palestine?
I think that the shift in discourse has indeed been enormous. If we look back the last 7, 8, 10 years, there's a shift in how it plays out in the media. You see mainstream news outlets on Israel's annual birthday celebrations in May suddenly having to talk about the Nakba. They have to have Palestinian voices. They don't get it right. They don't usually define it right. They don't pronounce it right. But they have to deal with it. That's new. That was never the case before. In the newspapers, you see Palestinian voices as a matter of course. Again, are they representative of everybody? Well, some are, some aren't. But the point is they have to be there. There's a recognition of that. You have mainstream writers in the Washington Post, arguably the most pro-Israel of the main national dailies. One of their investigative reporters, Walter Pincus, writing article after article about the consequences of the massive amount of U.S. military aid to Israel, the $30 billion over these 10 years that the U.S. is sending Israel. The outrage that you saw from very mainstream sources, from Jon Stewart to the New York Times, when Israel and Israeli backers in the U.S., the pro-Israel lobbies, demanded that despite the sequester, despite the fact that people in this country were losing access to medical care, kids were being kicked out of Head Start, people couldn't get access to doctors, that Israel, the 23rd wealthiest country in the world, was demanding that its allocation of military aid not be touched, that it should be special, that they shouldn't face the cuts that 100% of every other amount of money in the U.S. budget was going to face. People were outraged in a way you never would have seen before. The Jewish discourse on this has changed massively. Fewer Jews are that interested in Israel, and those who are, overwhelmingly in very high proportions, don't want to move towards the kind of right-wing pandering to Bibi Netanyahu's government that we've seen from officials, from the White House, from Congress, etc. So you've seen this enormous shift. The reason it hasn't translated goes to the whole nature of what U.S. policy on Israel-Palestine is all about. It's partly about the strategic value, which has gone up and down over the years. There were times during the Cold War when Israel was a huge, important ally that the U.S. could count on to be a cat's paw of their interests around the world. Then there's periods, we saw this right during the first Gulf War, at the end of the Cold War, 1990, 91. Suddenly Israel's involvement vis-a-vis Iraq at the time was a huge problem for the U.S., where they wouldn't be able to have their Arab allies, ironically including Syria, who of course supported the U.S. and joined the attack on Iraq in 1991. But you had a demise of that value for Israel. Then it goes up again after 9/11. So that goes up and down. What doesn't change is the domestic role of Israel, the supporters of Israel who gained so much strength during the Cold War when they said, we demand that Israel be treated as with this special relationship, etc. That was a product of the Cold War. And it worked not just because they were rich and powerful. Yeah, they're rich and powerful, but plenty of other people are rich and powerful who don't agree with them. The reason it worked is because for a while it matched those strategic goals. Once that match split apart, it became possible to challenge the lobby in whole new ways, but we haven't yet seen it go far enough. The White House particularly, as well as Congress, still act as if it's political suicide to criticize Israel, and it's now up to us to show them that that's just wrong.
Internationally, in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, there's complete disillusionment with the idea of negotiations where you don't have a balance of power. You look at the extent to which the settlements have increased throughout the West Bank. There's a significant debate going on about whether a two-state solution should continue to be pursued or whether we should be calling for one state. Do you think that's an important debate for us to have and figure out in order for us to have advocacy on Palestine?
I think it's very important for Palestinians to figure it out. I don't think it's important for those of us who are Americans, who are British, who are Australian, who are South African, who are Brazilian, who work in solidarity with Palestinian rights, who stand for human rights, international law, and equality for all. It's not our call. I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't live there. I don't get to say one state, two state, red state, blue state. This isn't my business. My business is, what is my government doing that denies Palestinians their rights, their right of return, their right to live not under occupation, their right inside Israel to be full first-class citizens and not relegated to second, third, fourth class. That's my role. So I don't think that it's something that we should be worrying about. We have to demand a U.S. policy, and we can certainly demand an Israeli policy, that is grounded in international law, human rights, and equality. You could imagine that happening with two states if there were no settlements, or if the settlements were part of being Palestinian citizens, and they were no more privileged than anyone else. They didn't have the protection of the Israeli military. You didn't have them getting all the water and Palestinian villagers getting none, as is currently the situation. Or you could imagine it in a one-state environment. That won't be easy either. One state right now will be an apartheid state. Functionally, legally, that's what exists right now anyway. In effect, it's not called a state, but if you put together the three territories, Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel proper, one government controls all of them, and that's Israel, with different systems. That's the definition of apartheid. So the struggle against apartheid in that environment is going to be a long and difficult one. It's not to say that because a two-state solution is increasingly out of reach or impossible, that a one-state solution is going to be so easy. But I think our job is to fight for rights, not to worry so much about the final arrangement.
One last question for you before we wrap this up. You've been active on the issue of Palestine for a very long time. Having seen it the way it has progressed, are you optimistic about the future?
It's a hard question. I'm rather pessimistic about what's happening now. There's no good news on the ground. The situation for ordinary Palestinians in the occupied territories, in the refugee camps, inside Israel, is pretty terrible. But I'm optimistic because there's a new generation of people who have recognized that the old way isn't working. The old factions aren't providing the leadership that's needed. And they're saying, you know what, we're not bound by that. We want a representative that can speak in the name of all Palestinians. If it's going to be the PLO is going to have to do some major shakeups. If it's going to be something else, maybe, but it doesn't exist yet. In the meantime, we in civil society are going to take the initiative. So the call for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement around the world, which has had such incredible impact everywhere in the world. In the U.S., it's matched by the work against U.S. military aid to Israel, but still, BDS is very important here. In the rest of the world, it's the only thing that's really crucial in that solidarity movement. And that came as a call from Palestinian civil society, not from the factions, not from the political leadership, not from the negotiators. And that's who people around the world are looking to. So I think as we develop real ties of solidarity between people, we can look forward to something that's a little bit more optimistic than what we've seen in the past.
I wish we could talk longer. We never have enough time actually to go over everything that you actually know and can talk about very compellingly. But thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Omar. It's been great.
Thank you.